I am George, 63 years old, and until recently, I believed I had raised a son who understood the value of loyalty. When I called to ask what time I should arrive for the grand opening of his new craft brewery, a business I personally bankrolled with a $600,000 investment, my daughter-in-law Monica answered the phone. With a chilling, dismissive sigh, she said it was 5 days ago. We only invited close family and friends. A few days later, she called back, her voice desperate and demanding. The commercial lease and utility bills are overdue. Did you transfer the money? I just smiled into the receiver and said, I only fund close family. Before I continue this story of how I dismantled their arrogant little empire, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who treated you like nothing more than an ATM. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the reality of my situation finally shattered the illusion I had been living in. I was sitting at my kitchen table, a scuffed Formica surface that my late wife and I had bought second-hand 30 years ago. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I had spent the entire morning ironing my best suit, a navy blue two-piece I usually saved for weddings and solemn occasions. Today was supposed to be a celebration. Today was the day my son Tyler was opening his craft brewery. I had every reason to be proud. I had spent 35 years working as a supply chain manager, negotiating shipping routes, managing warehouses, and squeezing pennies out of every contract to provide for my family. We lived frugally. We never took expensive vacations or bought luxury cars. We saved everything so our boy would have a head start. When my wife passed away from cancer 5 years ago, she left behind a substantial life insurance policy. It was money meant to secure my retirement, to ensure I would never be a burden to anyone as I grew older. But 2 years ago, Tyler came to me with a glossy business plan and a desperate plea. He wanted to open a brewery. He swore it would be a joint family legacy. He looked me right in the eye, sitting at this very kitchen table, and promised that my investment would make me a partner. I believed him. I handed over $600,000, virtually liquidating the insurance policy, and a massive chunk of my retirement savings to fund his dream. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2 p.m. Tyler had told me the grand opening was sometime this week, but he had been evasive about the exact details. I figured he was just overwhelmed with the final preparations and vendor deliveries. I picked up my phone, my heart swelling with anticipation, and dialed his number to ask what time I should head over to help set up. The line rang 4 times before someone picked up. It was not Tyler. It was Monica, his wife, George. She answered, her voice dripping with that familiar exhausted condescension she always used when speaking to me. What do you need? Tyler is extremely busy right now. I ignored her tone, keeping my voice light and cheerful. Hi, Monica. I am just calling to see what time the grand opening kicks off tonight. I have my suit ready to go, and I want to make sure I get there early to help out if you need an extra set of hands. There was a heavy, suffocating silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of music and clinking glasses in the background of her end. Then she let out a sharp, mocking sigh. George, the opening is not tonight. It was 5 days ago. The words did not make sense. I gripped the edge of the Formica table, my knuckles turning white. 5 days ago. But Tyler said you were opening this week. Why did nobody call me? Monica did not even try to soften the blow. Her words were sharp, deliberate, and designed to cut as deeply as possible. It was an exclusive launch, George. We only invited close family and friends. People who fit the brand image. You know how it is. We could not have you wandering around the tap room in your outdated clothes, bringing down the vibe. Before my brain could even process the sheer cruelty of what she had just said, the line went dead. She hung up on me. I sat there in my outdated kitchen, wearing the dress shirt I had painstakingly ironed just an hour before. The silence of the empty house pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. Close family and friends. The phrase echoed in my mind, each syllable a brutal hammer blow to my chest. I had given them $600,000. I had handed over the last physical manifestation of my late wife's love and protection. And to them, I was not even close family. I was just the old, unstylish man who financed their elite lifestyle. I did not cry. Tears are for people who feel a sense of loss. What I felt was a cold, hard awakening. I walked over to the closet and hung up my navy suit. I took off my dress shirt, folded it neatly, and put on my everyday flannel. The grief of losing my son to his own greed vanished, replaced by a sudden, crystal-clear understanding of the battlefield I was standing on. For 35 years, my job in supply chain logistics was to identify broken links, eliminate inefficiencies, and cut off vendors who failed to deliver on their contracts. My son and his wife had just breached their contract in the most spectacular way possible. For 4 days, I did not reach out to them. I did not send an angry text. I did not leave a tearful voicemail demanding an explanation. I went about my routine. I drank my coffee. I tended to the small vegetable garden in the backyard. I waited, because I knew something Monica and Tyler had conveniently forgotten in their arrogant triumph. The $600,000 was the initial capital investment, but they were still financially bleeding me dry on a monthly basis. When they were setting up the business, Tyler had begged me to help cover their commercial overhead until the brewery started turning a profit. Like an overly trusting father, I had set up an automatic transfer of $4,000 every single month from my checking account to their operating account to cover their commercial lease and utility bills. I knew the first of the month was approaching rapidly. On the 4th day of my total silence, my phone lit up. It was Monica. I let it ring 3 times before I calmly answered. "George," she snapped the moment the call connected. Her voice was no longer dripping with cool superiority. It was tight, frantic, and laced with absolute panic. The commercial lease payment bounced this morning. The landlord just marched into the tap room and threatened to lock the doors. And the electric company sent a final shut-off notice. "Did you forget to authorize the $4,000 transfer? You know the banking system takes a few days to process if you do not do it manually." I leaned back in my wooden chair, looking at the faded wallpaper of my kitchen. I could hear the desperate hum of the brewery in the background of her call. The empire I had bought for them was suddenly teetering on the edge of a cliff because they did not have my cash to prop it up. "You did not get the transfer?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady, entirely devoid of emotion. "No, I did not get it," she shrieked, her facade of high society elegance completely crumbling. "Tyler is having a panic attack in the back office. You need to wire the money directly to the commercial account right now, or they are going to shut off our power by noon. Do you hear me? We need that money right now." A slow, genuine smile spread across my face. I thought about the life insurance money. I thought about my unworn suit hanging in the closet. I thought about the words she had used to casually erase my existence from my own son's life just 4 days prior. "Monica," I said softly, making sure my voice was crystal clear. What she demanded. "I only fund close family." I pressed the end call button, placed the phone face down on the table, and let the beautiful silence of my home wash over me. The glowing screen of my old laptop cast a harsh blue light across the kitchen table. For 35 years, I made a living tracking shipments and identifying anomalies in supply chains. I spent decades sitting in fluorescent-lit offices looking for the exact moment a vendor decided to cut corners. Tonight, I was using those same skills on my own flesh and blood. I did not feel the urge to scream. I did not want to smash plates against the wall or demand an apology. Apologies are for misunderstandings. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated extraction of my resources. I opened my web browser and navigated to the banking portal. My fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced precision. The login screen asked for my password, and I typed it in without hesitation. When the dashboard loaded, I saw the familiar layout of my accounts, my personal checking, my modest savings, and sitting right below them was the joint operating account for the brewery. As the primary investor, I had insisted my name remain on the master account architecture. Tyler had rolled his eyes at the time, calling me old-fashioned, but he had agreed. That old-fashioned paranoia was about to become his absolute ruin. I clicked on the recurring transfers tab. There it was. The $4,000 automatic payment scheduled to leave my account on the 1st of every month. The lifeline. The invisible umbilical cord that allowed Tyler and Monica to play business owners without actually doing the work. I moved the cursor over the cancel button. A small dialog box popped up on the screen, asking if I was entirely sure I wanted to terminate this scheduled transaction. I did not blink. I clicked yes. The line item vanished from the screen. But that was not enough. Stopping the future bleeding was only step 1 of any crisis protocol. Step 2 was isolating the compromised nodes. I navigated to the account linking settings. Tyler had tied his personal checking and Monica's business expense cards to the master overdraft protection matrix. Every time they spent more than the brewery actually made, my personal accounts automatically covered the deficit to prevent bounced checks. It was a safety net I built because I loved my son and wanted his dream to survive its fragile first year. I selected Tyler's checking account and clicked Sever Connection. I selected Monica's corporate card and clicked Revoke Authorization. One by one, I systematically dismantled the financial architecture that kept their fantasy alive. With every click, I severed a piece of my relationship with the boy I had raised. By the time I finished, the brewery was financially quarantined. They were entirely on their own, standing on a trapdoor with no net below. With the defenses in place, I decided to run a full audit. I wanted to see exactly why a craft brewery that had supposedly been under construction for 2 years was already out of operating capital. I opened the transaction history for the last 12 months. I expected to see invoices for fermentation tanks or barley shipments or local marketing campaigns. Instead, I saw a horrifying landscape of sheer gluttony. My eyes scanned the ledger, tracing the digital footprints of their greed. 3 weeks ago, there was a charge for $2,000 at a high-end day spa in the city. The vendor name clearly indicated it was a luxury retreat. 2 days after that, I found a recurring payment of $1,200 to a leasing company that specialized in imported European sports cars. My son drove a modest sedan when he pitched this business to me. Apparently, the moment my $600,000 cleared, he decided a brewery owner needed to drive a luxury SUV. I kept scrolling downward, and the sickness in my stomach turned into a cold and absolute fury. I saw hundreds of dollars spent at expensive steakhouses on Tuesday nights. I saw massive charges at boutique clothing stores. I saw plane tickets to a coastal resort booked under Monica's name during a week. Tyler told me they were attending a crucial brewing convention. They had not been building a business. They had been building a lifestyle. The brewery was nothing more than a hollow shell, a theatrical prop they used to justify draining my late wife's life insurance equity. They treated my life savings as their personal slush fund. Every drop of sweat my wife shed working extra shifts at the clinic, every coupon she clipped, every vacation we skipped, so we could leave our son a legacy, had been funneled into Monica's spa treatments and Tyler's fragile ego. I sat back in my chair, letting the silence of the kitchen wash over me again. I felt incredibly foolish, but the foolishness was quickly burning away into something much more dangerous. I had given them everything, and they had taken it with a smile while planning to lock me out the moment the doors opened. They believed because I wore flannel shirts and drove a 10-year-old truck that I was stupid. They confused my paternal generosity with financial illiteracy. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about cash flow. Satisfied that the brewery accounts were entirely isolated, I decided to do a final check on my own personal safety nets. I needed to ensure that my remaining retirement funds were secure and that my credit was locked down. I navigated to my primary mortgage dashboard. I had paid off this house 10 years ago. It was my ultimate sanctuary. The one thing I owned completely free and clear. I kept a home equity line of credit active on the property simply as an absolute last resort emergency fund, a standard financial practice I had maintained for decades. I clicked on the tab to review the dormant credit line, expecting to see a zero balance and full available equity. The page loaded slowly, the little blue circle spinning on the screen. When the numbers finally appeared, I stopped breathing. I leaned closer to the monitor, convinced my tired eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim light. I took off my reading glasses, wiped them on my shirt, and put them back on. The numbers did not change. The balance on my home equity line of credit was not zero. It was negative $150,000. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic and terrifying rhythm. I scrolled down with a trembling hand, opening the detailed document view. I clicked on the original loan origination file attached to the withdrawal. A scanned document appeared on my screen. It was a secondary commercial equipment loan legally tied to the brewery's operating license. But that was not what made the blood freeze in my veins. At the very bottom of the final page on the line designated for the primary property guarantor was my signature. I stared at the looping letters. It looked exactly like my handwriting. The slant of the G and the sharp tail of the B were perfectly replicated. But I had never seen this document in my life. I had never sat in a bank and agreed to leverage the home my wife and I built to buy commercial brewing equipment. I had never authorized a $150,000 lien against my own property. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. The disrespect regarding the opening party was a minor emotional insult. The embezzlement of the operating capital was a gross breach of trust. But this was entirely different. My own son had forged my signature. He had committed a severe federal felony to secretly leverage my home behind my back. I looked at the date on the loan origination. It was signed 3 months ago. Right around the time Tyler had asked to borrow my old metal filing cabinet, claiming he needed it to organize some business permits. He had spent hours in my home office entirely unsupervised with unrestricted access to years of my legal documents, tax returns, and signature samples. I closed the laptop slowly. The blue light vanished, leaving me in the shadows of my kitchen. The game had just changed. This was no longer about teaching an ungrateful child a lesson in financial responsibility. This was about survival. Tyler and Monica had not just stolen my past. They had quietly engineered the theft of my future. They had put a ticking time bomb under the very roof over my head. I stood up in the dark, my hands no longer trembling. The father who had ironed his suit for his son's party was dead. The supply chain manager was fully awake, and it was time to orchestrate a complete and total liquidation. The morning sun offered no warmth as I backed my heavy truck out of the driveway. I had not slept a single minute. I had spent the remaining hours of the dark night sitting motionless at my kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. The revelation of the massive lien against my property had completely burned away the last lingering remnants of the forgiving father I used to be. I gripped the steering wheel, feeling the worn leather texture under my calloused hands. I drove slowly through the familiar suburban streets where I had once taught Tyler how to ride his first bicycle. The neatly trimmed lawns and quiet, peaceful driveways felt like a bitter mockery to me now. My entire life had been built on a foundation of hard work and honest sacrifices, and now that foundation was cracking beneath my feet. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the cab of my truck was absolute, broken only by the low, rhythmic hum of the engine. I was not angry. Anger is a chaotic, messy emotion that clouds your judgment and forces you to make foolish mistakes. What I felt was a cold, calculated clarity. The kind of absolute clarity a man feels when he realizes he is standing in a room with a dangerous predator. The bank branch was just unlocking its doors when I pulled into the empty parking lot. It was the exact same branch where my late wife and I had enthusiastically opened our very first joint checking account over 30 years ago. I walked through the thick glass doors, entirely ignoring the cheerful morning greetings of the young tellers behind the counter. I marched straight to the corner office of the branch manager, Mr. Barnes. He was a meticulous, serious man with graying hair and a quiet, professional demeanor. He was someone I had trusted with my personal finances for over a decade. He looked up from his computer monitor, a polite, welcoming smile forming on his face, but that smile vanished the exact moment he registered the severe expression in my eyes. I did not offer any polite small talk or morning pleasantries. I stepped into his office, shut the heavy wooden door firmly behind me, and sat down in the leather chair across from his desk. I looked him directly in the eyes and demanded he pull the complete physical file for the home equity line of credit currently attached to my residential property. Mr. Barnes frowned deeply, clearly sensing the absolute rigidness and tension in my voice. He tapped quickly on his keyboard, reviewing his screen, before standing up without a word to retrieve the physical documents from the secure filing room in the back. The 5 minutes he was gone felt like an eternity. When he finally returned, he placed a remarkably thick manila folder on the polished wood of his desk. He opened it carefully, pulling out a heavy stack of stapled legal papers and sliding them directly toward me. I picked up the document. It was a secondary commercial equipment loan officially tied to the operating license and business tax identification number of the craft brewery. The loan was collateralized directly against the paid-off equity of my personal home. I slowly turned the pages, reading the dense legal jargon, detailing the extreme financial obligations and liability clauses. Then I reached the final page, the guarantor agreement. I stared at the bottom of the page, my breath catching in my throat. There it was. My full name, George Bennett, signed in blue ink on the dotted line. The loops, the angles, and the slight pressure variations were a nearly perfect replica of my handwriting. To a stranger or even a trained bank employee processing a mountain of daily paperwork, it was an undeniable authorization. But I knew the absolute truth. I had never touched this piece of paper. I had never authorized a single penny of this debt. My own son had stolen my signature. The memory hit me with a sickening, violent clarity. 3 months ago, long before the brewery opening, Tyler had come over to my house on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He had been overly affectionate that day, bringing me a cup of my favorite dark roast coffee, acting like the devoted and caring son. He asked casually if he could borrow the heavy oak filing cabinet from my home office. He claimed he desperately needed a secure place to organize his commercial permits, vendor contracts, and licensing paperwork for the new business. Like a blindly trusting fool, I smiled and told him to go right ahead. I had sat in the living room reading a novel, while Tyler spent 2 uninterrupted hours entirely alone in my office. He had unrestricted access to decades of my sensitive legal documents, old tax returns, and countless canceled checks. He had not been organizing permits that afternoon. He had been meticulously studying my handwriting. He had been practicing the exact curve of my signature to commit a severe federal felony right under my roof. The betrayal morphed and mutated in that very instant. It was no longer just a cruel, emotional slight about a party invitation. It was not just an entitled child taking advantage of his father's generosity to lease sports cars. It was a highly calculated, premeditated crime designed to exploit my entire life savings. He had smiled in my face, drank coffee in my kitchen, and actively plotted to risk the roof over my head. I was abruptly pulled from my dark thoughts by the sound of Mr. Barnes clearing his throat. He looked at the paperwork in my hands, then looked at me with deep professional concern. "George," he said softly, his voice tight with genuine anxiety. "There is something else you urgently need to know about this specific loan account." I looked up, my face a mask of stone. "Tell me." "The first scheduled monthly repayment for this commercial loan was due 3 days ago," Mr. Barnes explained, nervously adjusting his tie. "Yesterday afternoon, the automated clearinghouse attempt to pull the required funds from the brewery operating account was returned for insufficient funds. The payment bounced." I stared at the bank manager without blinking. A bounced payment on a massive commercial loan tied directly to my residential property. I realized instantly that because I had completely severed their financial lifeline and stopped my monthly transfers, Tyler did not have the cash to cover his own fraudulent debt. His reckless spending on luxury cars and expensive spas had emptied the accounts, and now the consequences were crashing down. "What exactly happens now?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm and even. Mr. Barnes folded his trembling hands together on the desk, looking at me with profound sympathy. George, because this is a high-risk commercial equipment loan, backed heavily by residential collateral, the bank has an extremely strict default policy. I am legally obligated to send a formal notice today. If the financial arrears are not completely satisfied within 30 days, the bank will automatically begin foreclosure proceedings on your house. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and devastating. 30 days. I had exactly 1 month before the bank would attempt to seize the home where I had lived for 3 decades. Tyler had handed my sanctuary over to the wolves to finance his ego. I did not panic. I simply nodded neatly, folded the copy of the forged loan document, and placed it securely in my coat pocket. I thanked Mr. Barnes for his time, stood up, and walked out of the bank. I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I needed a shark, and I knew exactly which ocean to find one in. What is your thought on this? I left the bank parking lot and merged onto the highway, heading straight toward the city center. I did not call Tyler. I did not send an angry text message demanding an explanation. Confrontation is exactly what a desperate person expects. It gives them a chance to deploy excuses to weave new lies and to manipulate your emotions with fake tears and empty promises. I was completely done with emotions. I was operating purely on logistics, now treating my own son as a rogue vendor who had critically breached a contract. As the suburban trees faded into towering structures of glass and steel, my mind sharpened. I parked in a subterranean garage beneath a high-rise building that housed some of the most ruthless legal minds in the state. I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor. The doors slid open to reveal a quiet, sleek reception area clad in dark marble and brushed steel. I did not need an appointment. I was there to see Warren Gallagher. Warren was not just a random commercial attorney. Decades ago, before he ever went to law school, he and I had worked side by side in corporate supply chain management. We had spent our youth tearing apart broken logistics networks and liquidating failing suppliers. Warren was a corporate shark even back then, a man who saw the world entirely in terms of leverage and liability. We respected each other because we both understood that the fine print is the only thing that separates a successful empire from total ruin. When I walked past the receptionist and stepped into his massive corner office, he was standing by floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling city below. He turned around, his sharp eyes evaluating my plain flannel shirt and the heavy manila folder tightly gripped in my hand. He knew immediately that this was not a friendly social visit. I walked across the plush carpet and sat in the leather chair opposite his enormous mahogany desk. Warren sat down and folded his hands, waiting in absolute silence. He was a man who never wasted words. I opened the folder and placed 2 separate stacks of paper on the polished wood between us. I pushed the first document toward him. It was the forged commercial equipment loan that the bank manager had given me an hour earlier. I pointed to the signature at the bottom of the guarantor page. I told Warren that my son had used my old filing cabinet to practice my signature and secretly leveraged my paid-off home for $150,000. I told him the first payment had already bounced, and the bank was threatening foreclosure within 30 days. Warren picked up the paper, his expression completely unreadable. He studied the forged signature with the cold, analytical gaze of an apex predator. He did not offer empty sympathy or useless gasps of shock. He simply placed the forgery down and asked what the second stack of papers was. I slid the second document across the mahogany desk. It was the original operating agreement and funding contract for the brewery, the very paperwork Tyler had so eagerly signed 2 years ago when I handed over the $600,000 from my late wife's life insurance. Tyler had treated that money like a blank check, a magical gift from a foolish old man who did not understand modern business. But Warren knew me better than that. Warren knew I never did anything without building a fail-safe into the architecture. Warren put on his reading glasses and began to review the thick stack of pages. The room was perfectly silent, save for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. I watched his eyes scan the paragraphs, waiting for him to reach page 14. I knew exactly what was printed on page 14. A slow, dangerous smile crept across Warren's face as his finger stopped on a specific paragraph hidden deep within the funding terms. He looked up at me, taking off his glasses, his eyes gleaming with profound professional satisfaction. He tapped the paper and said, "Your boy really did not read the fine print, did he?" I shook my head slowly. Tyler and Monica had been so blinded by the zeros on the check and the prospect of their new elite lifestyle that they had rushed through the signing process. They assumed the money was a straightforward family gift, a massive parental handout with absolutely no strings attached. But as Warren pointed out to the empty room, the $600,000 was never classified as a gift. It was legally structured as a secured convertible promissory note. For those who do not understand corporate finance, a convertible note is a highly specific type of debt. It meant the brewery officially owed me $600,000. The contract clearly stipulated that as long as the business remained in good standing, the debt would sit quietly and collect a modest interest. But the exact moment the company defaulted on any of its primary financial obligations, such as bouncing a payment on a commercial loan or failing to pay their commercial lease, the debt could be instantly recalled. And if the business could not pay the cash back, the debt would automatically convert into controlling equity. Warren leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. He explained the lethal beauty of the situation we now found ourselves in. We were not just going to report the forgery to the police to save my house. Simply clearing the lien was a defensive move, and neither of us believed in playing defense when an asset was under attack. We were going to trigger the convertible note. Warren outlined the strategy with surgical precision. Because Tyler had bounced the payment on the fraudulent equipment loan, he had officially triggered the default clause embedded in my original contract. My son had essentially handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy his kingdom. Warren explained that by executing the conversion clause, my $600,000 in debt would instantly transform into an 80% majority ownership stake in the entire brewery. Tyler and Monica would lose their company overnight. They would be legally stripped of their ownership titles, their executive privileges, and their absolute control over the business they loved to show off. The very company they used to elevate their social status, the company that hosted a grand opening party I was not wealthy enough to attend, would legally belong entirely to me. I sat back in the leather chair, letting the massive weight of the plan settle deep into my bones. A small part of my heart, the part that still remembered building wooden treehouses and teaching a little boy how to tie his shoes, ached with a profound and suffocating sadness. But the memory of that forged signature, the memory of Monica hanging up on me, buried that sadness under a heavy mountain of cold resolve. I looked Warren straight in the eyes and told him to execute the strategy. I wanted full control of the brewery, and I wanted it immediately. Warren did not waste a single second. He called his paralegal into the office and began dictating the official notice of default. He drafted the corporate restructuring documents that would forcibly convert my debt into majority equity. He printed the heavy legal notices on his firm's thick, intimidating letterhead. He placed them in a certified overnight envelope, addressing it directly to Tyler's business office at the brewery. The trap was no longer just set. The trap had been firmly sprung. I walked out of the law firm and stepped back into the bright city sunlight. My son thought he could quietly steal my home, but he was about to realize I was coming to legally conquer his entire world. It was a bustling Friday night, and the city air carried a crisp chill that felt strangely refreshing. I sat in the driver's seat of my old heavy-duty truck, parked quietly in the deep shadows across the street from the brewery. The massive brick building glowed with warm, expensive lighting that spilled out onto the crowded sidewalk. Through the massive glass windows, I could clearly see the grand tasting event in full swing. This was the highly exclusive party Monica had deemed me too unstylish to attend. I watched as local social media influencers and minor city politicians stepped out of luxury rideshare vehicles. They posed for photographs in front of the custom-fabricated metal entrance sign. the very sign my life savings had paid for. The parking lot was filled with luxury sedans and shiny sports cars. Inside the building, the music was loud enough to vibrate the large front windows. The room was packed with people dressed in expensive casual wear, holding up their elegant tasting glasses for the flashing cameras. Monica was floating through the dense crowd, wearing a dark designer dress that likely cost more than my first automobile. She was smiling brightly, playing the role of the wealthy, successful entrepreneur to absolute perfection. Tyler stood behind the long, polished mahogany bar, acting like the undisputed king of the city, pouring expensive drinks from the imported electronic draft system. They looked completely invincible. They looked like they owned the world. But I knew the absolute truth. They owned absolutely nothing. Earlier that week, I had made a very quiet and very critical phone call from the kitchen of my suburban home. When a new business opens a large commercial space, they must establish utility accounts for water and heavy electrical usage. Because Tyler had zero commercial credit history and no real assets of his own, the utility companies required a financial guarantor to legally assume liability for any unpaid balances. 2 years ago, I had gladly signed those guarantee forms to help my son get his dream off the ground. But after discovering the forged signature and severing their access to my bank accounts, I realized I was still legally exposed to their operational debts. I called the commercial dispatch office of the regional electric provider to formally revoke my status as their financial guarantor. The customer service representative had been very polite, but she also delivered a piece of incredibly damning information. The brewery commercial account was massively in arrears. Tyler had completely ignored the electric bills for over 2 months, simply assuming my automatic bank transfers would eventually cover the severe deficit. The representative warned me that by removing my name from the guarantee, the account would immediately trigger a strict delinquency protocol. Without a reliable guarantor on file, and with thousands of dollars in unpaid bills, the power company would initiate a remote service disconnection within 48 hours. I politely thanked her for the detailed information and confirmed my request to be permanently removed from the account. I did not call Tyler to warn him. I simply let the inevitable consequences of his own financial negligence take their natural and brutal course. I looked at the digital clock on my glowing dashboard. It was exactly 8 in the evening, the absolute peak hour of their highly exclusive VIP tasting event. I rolled down my truck window and listened to the heavy rhythmic bass of the music pumping from the crowded building. I watched Monica step up onto a small platform and raise a glass to make a toast to a group of influential local food bloggers. And then, in a single beautiful instant, the entire building plunged into absolute darkness. The vibrant neon signs outside flickered and died. The massive industrial lights inside the bustling taproom vanished instantly. The loud music cut off so abruptly that the sudden silence felt heavy and thick and incredibly awkward. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. I could hear the confused murmurs of the large crowd drifting across the dark street. A few people nervously laughed, probably thinking it was part of a planned theatrical show. Then the harsh reality of the situation settled in. Cell phone flashlights began to illuminate the pitch-black room, casting erratic and chaotic shadows against the expensive, exposed brick walls. The fancy electronic draft system, which required constant high-voltage electricity to regulate the pressure, completely shut down. The taps stopped flowing immediately. The exclusive party was entirely dead. The flawless brand image Monica had spent thousands of my dollars to cultivate was disintegrating right in front of her most important guests. Even from the dark street, I could see the sheer panic setting in. The bright glow of cell phone lights moved frantically away from the bar and rushed toward the back office. I knew exactly what was happening behind those closed doors. The intense pressure of the sudden crisis was violently exposing the deep fundamental cracks in their marriage. Monica was not a supportive partner who would stand by her husband during a difficult crisis. She was a demanding passenger who only cared about the luxury and status of the ride. In the dark, cramped office, she completely lost her mind. She screamed at Tyler, demanding to know why the power was out and why he was ruining her perfect evening. She blamed his incompetence, hurling vicious insults at him, while the confused VIP guests lingered awkwardly in the dark tap room outside. Tyler, desperate to save his fragile ego and calm his furious wife, tried to play the role of the confident, commanding executive. He pulled out his heavy metal platinum corporate credit card, the exact card he had used to lease his luxury sports car and fund their lavish personal lifestyle. He promised Monica he would simply pay the emergency reconnection fee over the phone and have the lights back on in 5 minutes. He promised her it was just a minor administrative glitch that his vast wealth could easily fix. Tyler quickly dialed the emergency commercial utility line. He put the call on speakerphone, setting the device on his dark desk so Monica could hear him heroically solve the embarrassing problem. The dispatcher answered after a short hold and calmly explained that the commercial account was severely past due and that the primary financial guarantor had officially withdrawn all support earlier in the week. Tyler, arrogant and highly annoyed, demanded they process an immediate emergency payment to restore service to the building. He slowly and confidently read the 16 digits of his shiny platinum corporate card to the dispatcher, speaking loudly so Monica could hear his authority. He waited for the confirmation, expecting the problem to disappear with a simple swipe. The dispatcher paused. The silence on the speakerphone stretched out for several agonizing seconds while the payment system processed the request. Then the dispatcher spoke again, her voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "Sir, that corporate card has been declined." Tyler told her she must have made a typing mistake. He demanded she run the numbers again, shouting that it was a premium executive account with a massive spending limit. The dispatcher patiently ran the card a second time. "I am sorry, sir, it is declining again." The dispatcher read the administrative note attached to the billing file. "All secondary cards and linked business accounts have been permanently frozen by the primary account holder, George Bennett." The realization hit Tyler like a physical blow to the chest. The endless safety net was totally gone. The infinite bank was completely closed. The lights were out, and the old unstylish man they had discarded was the one holding the switch. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet sanctuary of my home. The house was completely still. The only sound was the steady ticking of the old wall clock my late wife had purchased decades ago. I had a single cup of black coffee resting on the worn Formica surface. I did not need to be at the brewery to know exactly what was happening. I could picture the dark room. I could imagine the wealthy influencers fumbling for the exits. I knew Tyler would not stay there to face the humiliation. A coward always runs from a public failure and seeks a private target to blame. I did not have to wait long. About 30 minutes after the power grid had severed his grand opening party, a pair of bright headlights swept aggressively across my living room window. I heard the loud screech of expensive tires skidding to a violent halt in my driveway. A car door slammed with enough force to rattle the glass. Heavy, angry footsteps stomped up the front walkway. Then came the pounding. It was not a polite knock. It was a furious, entitled hammering against my solid oak front door. The heavy thuds echoed through the quiet house like a temper tantrum from an overgrown child. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my simple flannel shirt. I walked down the hallway and unlocked the deadbolt. The moment I opened the door, Tyler pushed his way inside. He did not say hello. He did not ask if I was doing well. He was breathing heavily, his face flushed a deep, angry red. The expensive tailored suit he wore looked ridiculous on a man throwing a childish fit. "Are you out of your absolute mind?" he screamed at me, his voice echoing off the living room walls. He paced back and forth, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair. "Do you have any idea what you just did? You completely ruined the most important night of my entire life. Half the city council was in that room. Food critics with hundreds of thousands of followers were holding empty glasses in pitch-black darkness. Monica was crying in the office. You humiliated us. You humiliated my wife." I closed the front door quietly and leaned against the frame. I watched him pace. I did not interrupt his performance. You need to pick up your phone right now and fix this, Tyler demanded, pointing an aggressive finger at my chest. You need to call the utility company and put your name back on that commercial guarantee. Then you need to log into the banking portal and authorize the transfer to turn my corporate cards back on. The emergency dispatcher said it would take a massive deposit to restore the power grid tonight. You are going to pay it. You are going to fix this massive mess you created. He stopped pacing and glared at me, breathing hard. When I did not immediately reach into my pocket for my phone, his angry red face twisted into a mask of pure emotional cruelty. He decided to deploy the ultimate weapon Monica had likely armed him with on the drive over. Listen to me very closely, Tyler hissed, lowering his voice into a vicious threat. Monica is absolutely furious. She told me that if you do not restore our accounts right this second, she is going to cut you out of our lives completely. When we have children, you will never meet them. You will never be allowed to hold your future grandchildren. You will die alone in this outdated house, and we will not even come to your funeral. Fix the accounts right now, or we are done with you. I stood there, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his manipulation. Years ago, a threat like that would have broken my heart. It would have brought me to my knees. I would have rushed to the bank to empty my savings just to keep my family together. But tonight, those words felt entirely hollow. They held absolutely no power over me anymore. The man standing in my living room was not my son. He was a parasite wearing a very expensive suit. I did not raise my voice. I gestured toward the kitchen. Come sit down, Tyler. He scoffed, clearly thinking he had won. He thought his threat regarding the unborn grandchildren had successfully terrified me into submission. He strutted into the kitchen and dropped himself into the wooden chair opposite my coffee cup. He crossed his arms, waiting for me to apologize and surrender. I sat down across from him. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. I placed it flat on the Formica table. I kept my hand resting gently on top of it. You and Monica have a very interesting view of me, I said, my voice steady and cold. I know exactly what she calls me behind my back. I know she told her wealthy friends that I am just a live-in handyman. She said you only keep me around out of charity. You think I am just an uneducated blue-collar worker who is only good for fixing broken pipes and signing checks. Tyler rolled his eyes, acting supremely annoyed. Do not start crying about a stupid joke Monica made at a dinner party. We are talking about my business. We are talking about my money. Fix the power. I slowly pushed the folded piece of paper across the wood. It stopped directly in front of his folded arms. Handymen fix power, Tyler, I said, looking directly into his eyes. Felons forge signatures. Tyler froze. His entire body went completely rigid. He looked down at the paper sitting on the table. He slowly uncrossed his arms and picked it up. As his eyes scanned the text, identifying the secondary commercial equipment loan, the angry red color rapidly drained from his face. He stared at the bottom of the page where my name was perfectly written in blue ink. The exact signature he had practiced for hours while I read a book in the next room. The transformation was instantaneous and pathetic. The arrogant, commanding chief executive officer completely evaporated. In his place sat a terrified little boy caught in a massive lie. His hands began to shake so violently that the paper rattled in his grip. He dropped the document back onto the table as if it had physically burned his fingers. Dad, he whispered, his voice cracking. The aggressive tone was completely gone, replaced by sheer terror. Dad, please, you do not understand. The contractor costs were ballooning. Monica wanted the imported Italian brewing tanks, and the budget was totally empty. I had to secure more funding to keep her happy. The bank required a property guarantor. I was going to pay it back. I swear to you, I was going to pay every single cent back before you ever found out. I sat perfectly still. My expression did not soften. The first payment bounced yesterday, Tyler. The bank is preparing to foreclose on my home in 30 days. You risked the roof over my head to buy imported brewing equipment to impress your wife. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, pleading with me. Please, Dad. You cannot go to the police. If you report this, they will arrest me. I will go to federal prison for fraud. It will completely ruin my life. Please just keep this in the family. We can fix this together. Just pay the past due balance and I will work every single day to pay you back. I promise. You are my father. You have to protect me. I slowly shook my head. The time for family favors expired the moment your wife hung up the phone on me 5 days ago. You breached the contract, Tyler. Now you have to face the penalty. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a second document. It was printed on the thick, imposing letterhead of Warren Gallagher Law Firm. I placed it on the table and slid it forward until it rested directly on top of the forged loan agreement. Tyler stared at the new document, his eyes wide with absolute dread. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "That is the official legal notice exercising the convertible note clause from my original $600,000 investment," I explained calmly. "Because you bounced a commercial loan payment, you have triggered a profound financial default. My debt has just been legally converted into an 80% majority equity stake in the brewery. I am not going to the police to save my house, Tyler. I am taking your entire company." Monday morning arrived with the pale gray light of an impending storm. I was awake long before the sun breached the horizon. I stood in my kitchen drinking bitter black coffee, feeling a profound sense of absolute calm. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a single text message from Warren Gallagher. It was done. The corporate restructuring paperwork had been officially filed and recorded with the state business registry. My $600,000 convertible note, the very debt Tyler had so arrogantly ignored, had been legally triggered. The sheer weight of that transaction shifted the entire universe. I was no longer a discarded investor or a neglected father. I was now the legal 80% majority owner of the brewery. I drove to the commercial district and parked my heavy truck in the back alley behind the massive brick building. Warren was already waiting for me at the rear loading dock, accompanied by a silent, meticulous man carrying a thick leather briefcase. This was the independent financial auditor we had hired to verify the remaining physical assets. We unlocked the back door using the master access codes Warren had legally secured from the property management company. The massive building smelled of stale hops and spilled beer, a lingering consequence of the power outage and the abandoned tasting event from Friday night. We walked straight into the main executive office. I sat in a modest chair in the far corner, folding my hands quietly in my lap. Warren sat directly behind the heavy mahogany desk that Tyler had purchased for himself using my money. The auditor stood by the filing cabinets, ready to begin his work. We waited together in the cold silence of the empty brewery. At exactly 9:30, the front doors rattled open. I could hear the sharp, rapid clicking of Monica high heels echoing across the polished concrete floor of the tap room. Tyler was speaking loudly, his voice strained with the frantic energy of a man desperately trying to maintain an illusion of control. He was complaining bitterly about the cleanup costs and blaming the utility company for the embarrassing blackout. They pushed open the glass door to the executive office and immediately froze in their tracks. Tyler stared at Warren sitting in his oversized leather chair. Then his eyes darted to me, sitting quietly in the shadows of the corner. The color rapidly drained from his face as he remembered the documents I had shown him in my kitchen. Monica, however, had not been present for that late-night revelation. Her initial shock instantly transformed into vicious, entitled anger. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, slamming her expensive designer handbag onto a nearby table. She demanded to know who these strangers were and why we were sitting in her private office. Tyler tried to take command, puffing out his chest and stepping forward. He pointed a trembling finger at Warren and ordered him to leave his building immediately. He shouted that this was a private corporate space and that he was going to call the police to have us all arrested for trespassing. Warren did not even blink at the hollow threat. He reached into his sleek briefcase and pulled out a stack of freshly printed legal documents bound with a thick blue seal. He placed them gently on the desk right in front of Tyler. Warren looked at my son with the cold, dead eyes of a corporate executioner. He informed Tyler that nobody was trespassing today. He explained with absolute surgical precision that as of 8 o'clock this morning, the corporate structure of the brewery had been entirely reorganized. Because the company had defaulted on the commercial equipment loan, a catastrophic financial breach had been legally triggered. Warren slid the new operating agreement toward Tyler. He suggested Tyler read the very first page before picking up the phone to dial emergency services. Tyler picked up the paper, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it steady. He read the words, and a look of pure, hollow devastation completely swallowed his arrogant facade. Monica snatched the paper from his trembling hands, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. Warren did not wait for her to finish reading. He narrated their downfall in a perfectly even and unforgiving voice. He explained that my initial investment was never a simple family gift. It was a secured debt backed by a convertible note. By failing to manage the business properly and defaulting on their commercial obligations, they had forfeited their rights. I had executed my legal option to convert my debt into equity. Tyler and Monica had been instantly and legally demoted. They were no longer the undisputed owners of the elite craft brewery. They were now merely 20% minority shareholders with absolutely no executive voting power and zero authority to make financial decisions. The brutal reality of the situation hung heavy in the stale air of the office. Warren continued explaining that they had been reclassified as at-will employees. Their massive unearned executive salaries were officially suspended pending a comprehensive review of the company ledgers. The auditor, standing silently by the door, stepped forward and began placing security locks on the filing cabinets. The psychological devastation in the room was absolute. Tyler collapsed against the doorframe, staring blankly at the polished concrete floor as the immense weight of his destroyed empire crushed his fragile ego. He had risked everything to impress his wife, including his own freedom and my home, and now he had absolutely nothing to offer her. Monica, however, refused to accept defeat. The reality of losing her elite status, her luxury spending accounts, and her powerful social image was entirely unacceptable to her arrogant nature. She threw the legal documents back onto the desk, her face twisted in a mask of pure venom. She screamed that this was an elaborate scam and that she would never work as a simple minimum wage employee in her own business. She refused to acknowledge that the business had been entirely built on my stolen money and my forged signature. Without another word to me or to her devastated husband, Monica spun around and stormed out of the office, her heels striking the floor with furious intensity. She pushed past the heavy glass front doors and marched out into the bright morning sunlight. I remained seated in the quiet corner of the office, watching her through the massive front windows. I saw her pace aggressively back and forth on the sidewalk. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number with frantic, desperate energy. I had spent 35 years analyzing human behavior in high-pressure corporate logistics. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was not calling a friend to cry about her misfortune. She was calling her own aggressive defense lawyer. She was frantically attempting to establish a brand new shadow corporation. She was formulating a hasty and illegal plan to transfer the expensive brewing equipment and the lucrative vendor contracts out from under my newly established control before the auditor could fully lock down the inventory. She paced like a caged animal on the pavement, her mouth moving rapidly as she barked orders into her phone. I watched the frantic gestures of her hands, knowing that every word she spoke was digging her deeper into a legal grave. A shadow corporation would require new tax identification numbers, new lease agreements, and entirely new vendor relationships. It was a logistical nightmare that took months to build properly, but she was arrogant enough to believe she could accomplish it in a single morning. Tyler remained slumped against the doorframe, entirely useless and completely oblivious to his wife actively plotting to steal the remaining assets right out from under him. He was too paralyzed by his own failure to see that his marriage was disintegrating just as fast as his business. I stood up from my chair and buttoned my flannel shirt, feeling a profound sense of readiness. The hostile takeover was legally complete, but the real war for the physical assets was just beginning. I turned to Warren and nodded, giving him the silent signal to begin the deep forensic dive into their chaotic financial records. I had secured the building and the corporate entity, but now I had to defend the supply chain from a highly motivated and deeply entitled thief. Monica did not waste a single second mourning the loss of the corporate office. She drove her leased luxury sedan to a high-end coffee shop across town and immediately opened her silver laptop. She was operating on pure adrenaline and blind arrogance. She firmly believed that commercial business was simply a matter of smooth talking and aggressive networking. She pulled up the master vendor list she had quickly emailed to herself before fleeing the brewery. She began dialing the primary suppliers one by one. She called the massive malt distributors in the valley. She called the glass bottle manufacturers on the coast. She called the regional logistics companies that handled their intricate shipping routes. She presented a beautifully constructed and entirely fraudulent lie. She told them a hostile family takeover was temporarily disrupting their daily operations. She claimed an estranged father had lost his mind and was trying to maliciously ruin their highly successful brand. She introduced her brand new shadow corporation, spinning it as a fresh, innovative venture, completely free from toxic family drama. She urged every supplier to quickly redirect all future shipments and outstanding invoices to her new business entity, promising them lucrative long-term contracts the exact moment the dust settled. She smiled into the phone using her sweetest, most persuasive voice, absolutely convinced she was completely outsmarting a foolish old man. Meanwhile, I sat comfortably in the executive office of the brewery, listening to the quiet tapping of the auditor, compiling the damning evidence of their massive embezzlement. I did not need to run around town making desperate, frantic phone calls. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a worn, leather-bound address book. It was an old-fashioned tool from an old-fashioned era, but it contained an intricate network of deep relationships Monica could never possibly understand. During my 30-year career in supply chain management, I did not just sit in a cubicle signing generic delivery manifests. I personally built the regional logistics pathways that kept this entire state moving. Decades ago, when the current owners of the biggest distribution companies were just young warehouse managers struggling to make weekly payroll, I was the man who taught them how to optimize their routes and aggressively negotiate freight rates. I mentored them. I attended their weddings. I stood by them when the commercial markets crashed. I knew the exact people Monica was currently trying to manipulate. I opened the leather book and dialed the private direct line of Marcus Thorne, the undisputed owner of the largest hops distribution network in the region. Marcus answered on the second ring. His voice carried the deep, genuine respect of a man who remembered exactly where he came from. I did not ask him for any illegal favors or shady backdoor deals. I simply gave him a professional courtesy call. I informed him that the corporate structure of the brewery had been legally reorganized under my absolute majority control. I calmly explained that the previous management, namely my son and his wife, had committed severe financial fraud and defaulted on their primary commercial loans. I warned him that Monica was likely going to contact him with a fictitious shadow corporation attempting to illegally redirect inventory and hijack existing vendor contracts. I advised Marcus to protect his own distribution company from their immense financial instability. Marcus thanked me profusely for the critical early warning. He promised to personally alert the entire regional supply chain network about the immense liability risk Tyler and Monica now posed to the industry. I hung up the phone feeling a cold, deep satisfaction. Monica thought she was playing a clever game of social manipulation. I was executing a masterclass in corporate blockade. Across town, Monica was sipping an expensive vanilla latte, staring eagerly at her laptop screen. She was waiting for the digital signatures to arrive for her new shadow contracts. She firmly believed her charm and social media status had successfully secured the raw materials she needed to rebuild her stolen empire. Her phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed Marcus Thorne, the king of the regional hops supply. She answered with a victorious smile, completely ready to finalize the illegal transfer of physical assets. She greeted him with enthusiastic praise, telling him how excited she was to take their business relationship to the next level under her new exclusive brand. Marcus did not return her cheerful greeting. His voice was cold, sharp, and entirely devoid of the friendly customer service tone she was accustomed to hearing. He did not let her finish her rehearsed sales pitch. He bluntly informed her that he was fully aware of the illegal shadow corporation she had hastily formed that morning. He told her he knew all about the fraudulent loan, the defaulted utility bills, and the massive embezzlement from the operating accounts. Monica felt the blood completely drained from her face. Her sweet, confident smile vanished instantly, replaced by sheer, absolute panic. She stammered desperately, trying to control the narrative, claiming it was all a terrible misunderstanding, manufactured by a jealous old man. Marcus cut her off with brutal finality. He explained that the old man she was insulting happened to be the most respected logistics manager in the entire state. He told her that George Bennett had personally saved his distribution company from total bankruptcy 20 years ago, and that the entire regional supply chain viewed him as an absolute legend. He informed Monica that her new contracts were rejected and instantly voided. He told her that her shadow corporation had been immediately blacklisted across the entire industry network. No reputable commercial supplier would ever do business with a company associated with her or Tyler ever again. Monica sat frozen in the crowded coffee shop, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of her failure. But Marcus was not finished delivering the devastating news. He explained that because of the severe management instability and the documented history of financial fraud, the remaining active contracts with the original brewery were being drastically modified. Every single supplier, from the malt farmers to the bottle manufacturers, had unanimously agreed to implement a strict financial protocol to protect their own assets. Effective immediately, the brewery was placed on absolute cash-on-delivery terms. No more rolling credit lines. No more 30-day grace periods. No more invoices paid with phantom funds. If they wanted a single grain of hops or a single empty glass bottle delivered to the loading dock, they had to hand the truck driver physical certified cash the exact moment the delivery arrived. The phone call ended, leaving Monica staring at her dark screen in total horror. She knew the devastating reality of those specific terms. Tyler had completely maxed out his corporate credit cards on luxury car leases and expensive dinners. She had secretly drained the remaining operating capital into a private account to buy a vacation condo behind his back. They had absolutely zero liquid cash available to purchase raw materials. Without raw materials, the massive, expensive brewing tanks sitting in the warehouse were completely useless. The elaborate production schedule Tyler had proudly posted on the office wall was entirely dead. The reality of their total financial ruin crashed down upon her. They had no money to buy supplies. They had no credit to borrow more. I remained in the executive office reviewing the auditor reports with a steady, calculated focus. The numbers painted a pathetic picture of two people who cared only about the appearance of success while rotting the foundation from the inside out. I knew the exact moment the supply chain slammed its doors shut on them. It is a very specific kind of silence that falls over a manufacturing facility when the raw materials simply stop arriving. The rhythmic hum of the grain mills ceased. The clinking of the bottling line was entirely absent. The large delivery trucks that usually rumbled through the back alley completely vanished from the daily schedule. Monica drove back to the brewery parking lot, but she did not come inside the building. She sat in her luxury sedan staring through the windshield at the massive brick structure that was supposed to be her permanent ticket to high society. She realized with crushing certainty that her entire strategy had imploded spectacularly. She could not charm her way out of a severe cash deficit. She could not manipulate a supply chain that viewed her as a toxic liability. Her shadow corporation was dead before it even filed its first tax return. Tyler was inside the building, wandering aimlessly through the silent production floor, looking at the empty fermentation tanks with a hollow, defeated expression. He had no cash to restart the complex machines. The silence of the paralyzed brewery was the loudest sound they had ever heard. The business had ground to an absolute deafening halt. The air inside the brewery had grown incredibly stagnant over the past few days. Without the constant heavy movement of grain shipments arriving at the loading dock, without the loud rushing of water pumping through the commercial pipes, and without the deep mechanical hum of the massive refrigeration units, the cavernous brick building felt exactly like a tomb. I sat quietly in the corner of the executive office with the door cracked open just enough to observe the production floor. I watched the dust motes drift lazily in the shafts of morning light that filtered through the high industrial windows. Tyler was pacing the floor near the empty stainless steel fermentation tanks. He had spent the last 48 hours obsessively staring at his phone, waiting for a miraculous financial rescue that was never going to come. A commercial business without raw materials is nothing more than an empty warehouse, and an empty warehouse still accrues massive daily costs. The reality of commercial real estate is completely unforgiving. The meter never stops running simply because your supply chain has violently collapsed. The heavy glass front doors of the tap room swung open, breaking the miserable, echoing silence. It was not a delivery driver finally willing to accept a credit line, and it was certainly not a paying customer. A tall, sharply dressed man, with a severe, uncompromising expression, walked onto the floor holding a thick manila folder. I recognized him immediately as Mr. Wallace, the ruthless owner of the commercial property management firm that controlled this entire industrial park. Tyler immediately rushed forward, forcing a wide, artificial smile onto his exhausted and pale face. He extended his shaking hand desperately, trying to project the image of a confident young executive experiencing a minor administrative delay. He launched into a frantic, rambling pitch about temporary cash flow issues, supply chain hiccups, and upcoming investor capital that was supposedly clearing the bank tomorrow. Mr. Wallace did not shake his hand. He did not return the smile. He simply pulled a stiff, heavily stamped legal document from the folder and pressed it firmly against Tyler's chest. It was a formal, unconditional commercial eviction notice. Tyler stepped back, his eyes scanning the terrifying black text as all the color completely drained from his face. Mr. Wallace spoke with the icy mechanical precision of a man who had seen 100 arrogant entrepreneurs fail. He stated clearly that the commercial lease had not been paid in over 3 months. The financial arrears were massive, accumulating severe late penalties with every passing day. Tyler tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse about a banking error, but I knew the exact truth because I had seen the ledger. Tyler had deliberately skipped 3 consecutive months of commercial rent to fund a lavish, incredibly expensive luxury vacation to an exclusive island resort. Monica had relentlessly insisted on the tropical trip, claiming she desperately needed high-quality content for her social media to promote their elite brand image. Tyler had chosen to buy his wife temporary happiness, using the very money required to keep a legal roof over his business. Mr. Wallace informed him that if a certified cashier check for the entire past due balance was not physically resting in his hands within 48 hours, the local county sheriff would arrive to permanently padlock the doors and legally seize all remaining assets inside the building. Mr. Wallace turned on his heel and walked out the glass doors, leaving Tyler standing completely alone in the center of his dying empire. He looked down at the eviction notice, his hands trembling so violently that the thick paper rattled in the quiet room. The grand illusion was officially over. Monica's shadow corporation had failed. The vendors had revolted. Now the actual physical ground beneath his feet was being legally pulled away. I quietly packed up my notes, slipped out the back exit before he could see me, and drove my truck back to my suburban home. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. A man drowning in the middle of a dark ocean will inevitably reach for the very ship he tried to sink. I sat at my quiet kitchen table, poured myself a cup of dark, bitter coffee, and waited. It did not take long. My cell phone vibrated heavily on the Formica surface. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I let it ring 3 times to let the anxiety build in his chest, then slowly pressed the answer button. I did not say hello, I just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing on the other end of the line. Dad, Tyler whispered, his voice cracking immediately. It was not the voice of the arrogant chief executive who had yelled at me in this very room just a few days prior. It was the frantic, sobbing voice of a terrified little boy. The tears were completely real this time. He was crying so hard he could barely form a coherent sentence. He confessed that the landlord had just served him with an eviction notice. He admitted he was 3 months behind on the rent. He begged me to help him. He pleaded with me to transfer the money to save the physical location, promising over and over that he would change, that he would work hard, that he would do whatever it took to make things right. Then he tried to play his final, desperate, emotional card. He tried to weaponize my own memories against me. "Dad, please," he sobbed through the phone. "Do you remember that wooden treehouse you built for me in the backyard when I was 10 years old? Do you remember how it stormed that first summer, and I was so scared the wind was going to tear it down? You went out in the pouring rain and nailed extra support beams to the trunk just so I would feel safe. You always protected me. You always made sure my foundation was secure. Please, I am begging you, do not let them tear down my business. We are family. I just need one more chance to make you proud." I sat perfectly still, letting his tears and his carefully calculated nostalgia wash over me. Years ago, a story like that would have broken my resolve completely. I would have felt the deep, instinctual, paternal urge to rush out into the storm and nail the support beams to his fragile life. I would have emptied my bank account to shield him from the harsh elements. But I was no longer that blindly trusting father. I saw the emotional manipulation for exactly what it was. A desperate thief trying to pick the lock to my vault using a sentimental key. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I let the silence stretch out across the phone line, forcing Tyler to sit in the agonizing weight of his own monumental failure. Finally, I spoke, my voice entirely devoid of any warmth or anger. I told him I remembered the treehouse perfectly. I reminded him that I had built that structure with my own 2 hands using honest sweat and solid wood, not forged signatures and stolen money. I let that hard truth hang in the air for a long moment. Then I delivered my terms. I told him I would pay Mr. Wallace. I told him I would personally hand the landlord a certified check to clear the massive arrears and legally save the physical building from the sheriff. Tyler let out a loud, gasping sob of pure relief, thanking me repeatedly, promising he would pay me back every single cent. I cut him off immediately. I told him my financial rescue came with one absolute non-negotiable condition. I would save the building, but in exchange I demanded a full independent forensic audit of the brewery financial books covering the entire last 12 months. I told him a ruthless team of accountants would dissect every single receipt, every bank transfer, and every hidden credit line. I demanded total, unhindered transparency. The sudden, suffocating silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. Tyler was absolutely terrified of what those accountants would uncover in the ledgers. He knew a true forensic audit would expose every dirty secret he and Monica had tried to bury. But he was entirely trapped. He had no leverage, no cash, and no other options. If he refused my terms, the sheriff would padlock the doors tomorrow. With a defeated, barely audible whisper, my son agreed to the audit. The heavy glass doors of the brewery did not open for customers on Wednesday morning. They opened for a team of 4 independent forensic accountants. They walked in carrying aluminum briefcases and portable scanners, moving with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of morticians arriving at a crime scene. I had hired the best firm in the state, giving them absolute authority to dissect every single financial transaction, every shredded receipt, and every deleted email associated with the business. Tyler and Monica stood near the empty bar, watching in absolute silence as the team systematically commandeered the executive office. I did not interfere. I simply pulled a modest folding chair into the far corner of the room, sat down, and opened a thick paperback novel I had brought from home. For 3 agonizing days, I sat in that corner and turned the pages, letting the terrifying weight of the audit slowly suffocate them. I knew from my decades in corporate logistics that nothing breaks a liar faster than the slow, methodical ticking of a clock while someone examines their numbers. The atmosphere inside the dead brewery grew increasingly toxic with every passing hour. Tyler paced the production floor, running his hands through his unwashed hair, his expensive suits replaced by wrinkled shirts. He believed he already knew the worst of it. He thought the accountants were just documenting his luxury car leases, the expensive dinners, and the forged commercial loan I had already confronted him about. He thought this was merely a formal humiliation, a harsh penalty he had to endure to keep the physical building from being seized by the landlord. He was trying to play the part of a humbled, cooperative son, occasionally bringing the auditors cups of coffee they politely declined. Monica, however, was behaving entirely differently. She was not pacing. She was sitting rigidly at a small table near the windows, aggressively chewing her fingernails. Her face was pale, and her eyes constantly darted toward the closed door of the executive office. Every time one of the accountants stepped out to ask a clarifying question about a specific vendor invoice, she visibly flinched. The arrogant high society woman who had confidently dismissed my existence 5 days prior was completely unraveling. By the afternoon of the second day, the tension between my son and his wife became thick enough to cut with a knife. The profound stress of the financial lockdown was violently stripping away the glamorous facade of their marriage. I listened as they began to snap at each other in harsh, venomous whispers near the empty fermentation tanks. Tyler accused Monica of distracting the auditors by refusing to easily hand over her corporate laptop password. Monica hissed back, calling him an incompetent coward who was letting his elderly father terrorize them. They were like two drowning sailors fighting over a single piece of driftwood, completely unaware that a massive shark was circling just beneath the surface. I turned another page of my book, sipping a bottle of water, watching their unified front slowly crack under the immense pressure of absolute transparency. They had built their entire relationship on the shallow foundation of stolen wealth, and now that the wealth was frozen, they had absolutely nothing left holding them together. On the morning of the third day, the lead forensic accountant, a sharp, meticulous woman named Sarah, walked out of the office. She carried a thick, neatly bound portfolio. The clicking of her sensible heels on the concrete floor echoed like a judge striking a gavel. Tyler immediately stopped his pacing and rushed toward her, forcing a pathetic, eager smile. He asked if they were finally finished, desperately hoping he could just sign a confession for his bad spending habits and move on with his life. Sarah did not look at him. She walked directly across the large room and handed the portfolio to me. I closed my novel, placed it on the floor, and opened the financial report. The numbers were laid out in stark, undeniable black and white. Tyler and Monica slowly walked over, standing a few feet away like guilty children waiting for their punishment to be read aloud. The air in the room grew entirely still. I scanned the executive summary, my eyes moving down the columns of identified liabilities and misappropriated funds. The luxury leases were fully documented. The extravagant restaurant charges were tallied. But then I reached a newly highlighted section on the fourth page. I stopped reading and looked up at my son. I asked Sarah to verbally explain the anomaly on page 4, so everyone in the room could hear it clearly. Sarah turned to Tyler, her voice completely devoid of emotion. She stated that while they had accounted for the operational losses and the personal luxury expenses, they had discovered a massive, glaring discrepancy in the capital reserves. Over $80,000 of original operating capital was completely missing from the master ledger. It had not been spent on the business, and it had not been spent on Tyler and his cars or vacations. It had simply vanished through a highly sophisticated series of ghost transactions over the past 9 months. Tyler frowned, genuine confusion washing over his exhausted face. He shook his head, stammering that there must be a mistake in the software. He insisted he had tracked every single dollar he wasted. He looked at me, pleading with his eyes, swearing that he had confessed to all of his financial sins. He swore he did not steal an extra $80,000. He demanded Sarah check the ledgers again, his voice rising in panic, as he realized he was being accused of an embezzlement he genuinely knew nothing about. I did not look at Tyler. I slowly shifted my gaze to Monica. All the blood had completely drained from her face. She looked as though the concrete floor had suddenly opened up beneath her feet. Her hands were trembling violently, and she took a slow, terrified step backward toward the exit. She looked like a trapped animal finally realizing the cage door was locked. Sarah opened her own copy of the report and continued speaking. She explained that the forensic software had successfully traced the ghost transactions. The $80,000 had been systematically siphoned out of the brewery accounts in small, untraceable increments to avoid triggering bank alerts. The money was routed through a third-party payment processor and deposited directly into a private hidden savings account. Sarah read the name on the secret destination account out loud. It was registered under Monica maiden name. The auditor then revealed the final destination of the stolen funds. Just 3 weeks ago, that exact $80,000 was wired to a luxury real estate brokerage as a cash down payment for an exclusive vacation condo on the coast. The deed for the condo was registered solely to Monica. She had been quietly preparing a luxurious escape plan entirely behind her husband's back. The silence that followed was absolute and devastating. Tyler slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The genuine confusion on his face violently shattered, replaced by a look of profound, agonizing betrayal. He had risked everything for her. He had committed a federal felony by forging my signature on a commercial loan just to keep the business afloat so she could maintain her wealthy lifestyle. He had ruined his relationship with his only father, facing utter financial ruin and potential prison time, all because he thought they were building an empire together. And the entire time he was desperately sinking the woman he loved, had been secretly bleeding the hull dry to buy herself a private tropical escape route. The realization crashed into him, destroying whatever love he still held for her. Monica opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She raised her hands defensively, backing away from the pure, unadulterated hatred radiating from her husband. Tyler unleashed a scream of absolute fury that shook the empty brewery. He lunged toward her, his voice cracking as he unleashed a torrent of vicious accusations. He screamed that she was a parasite, a deceitful thief who had destroyed his life while pretending to be his partner. He screamed about the sleepless nights he spent agonizing over the forged documents, terrified of going to jail, while she was secretly shopping for coastal real estate with stolen money. Monica screamed back, her arrogant mask entirely gone, blaming him for being a pathetic, weak man who could not pursue the life she deserved. I sat quietly in my folding chair, watching the fiery destruction of their marriage. The unified front they had so proudly displayed when they banned me from their opening party was completely eradicated. They were no longer a powerful elite couple looking down on a foolish old man. They were two desperate thieves tearing each other apart in the ruins of their own greed. I closed the financial portfolio, picked up my paperback novel, and stood up from my chair. I did not say a single word to either of them. The truth had already done all the talking necessary. I walked past their screaming match, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, leaving them locked in the dark prison they had built for themselves. The rain had started just after twilight, falling in a steady, cold rhythm against the roof of my house. I was sitting in my living room reading a biography of a 19th century industrialist when the doorbell rang. It was past 10 at night. I did not need to check the newly installed security cameras to know who was standing on my porch. Tyler was currently drowning in the wreckage of his shattered pride at some cheap motel. That left only one rat willing to swim back to the very ship she had tried to sink. I marked my page, placed the book on the side table, and walked to the front door. I opened it to find Monica shivering in the cold, damp air. The expensive designer dress she had worn to the brewery earlier that day was rumpled and stained with rain. Her heavy makeup was slightly smeared, giving her the appearance of an actress whose play had just been violently canceled. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, deliberately attempting to project an aura of total vulnerability. It was a masterful performance, but I had spent 35 years negotiating with desperate suppliers who promised the world while hiding empty warehouses. I knew a fabricated crisis when I saw one. She asked if she could come inside, shivering dramatically and wrapping her arms around her chest. I did not say a word. I simply stepped back and opened the door wider, allowing her to step into the warm, dry hallway of the home she had so recently mocked. I led her into the kitchen and motioned toward the wooden chair opposite my usual spot. She sat down, keeping her posture small and defensive. I walked over to the sink, filled a simple glass with cold tap water, and placed it gently on the Formica table right in front of her. I sat down, folded my hands together, and waited. I knew the rules of a hostile negotiation. The person who speaks first is the person who loses the leverage. Monica took a slow, trembling sip of the water. Then she launched into her meticulously rehearsed narrative. Her voice shook with manufactured sorrow as she began to completely dismantle her husband. She told me I did not know the real Tyler. She painted a horrifying picture of closed doors and hidden cruelty. She claimed Tyler was deeply abusive, controlling every aspect of her daily life with an iron fist. According to Monica, the luxury car leases, the expensive vacations, and the high-end dinners were never her idea. She spun a tale of a megalomaniac who forced her to project a wealthy lifestyle to feed his own fragile ego. She swore she was absolutely terrified of his sudden explosive temper and went along with the reckless spending only to keep him from lashing out at her in private. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of polite attentiveness. I did not interrupt her. I did not challenge the obvious holes in her story. I just let her talk. She leaned forward across the table, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She told me she had actively begged Tyler not to leverage my house. She claimed she cried and pleaded with him the day he stole my signature, but he physically threatened her to keep quiet. She was entirely throwing the man who had risked federal prison for her directly under the tires of a speeding truck. It was a breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated selfishness. She spoke continuously for 20 agonizing minutes, weaving a complex tapestry of victimhood and helpless compliance. She wanted me to view her as a captive prisoner who had finally managed to escape her cruel warden. When she felt she had thoroughly convinced me of her complete innocence, she finally laid her cards on the table. She took a deep breath, wiped a single calculated tear from her cheek, and presented her business proposition. She acknowledged that I now held 80% of the corporate equity. She knew she and Tyler retained a useless 20% minority stake. She leaned closer, her eyes hardening with the cold calculation of a true mercenary. She offered me a comprehensive deal. She promised to formally sign over her entire portion of the remaining minority shares, giving me absolute, undisputed ownership of the brewery. Furthermore, she offered to act as the primary star witness for the federal authorities and the bank. She promised to testify in open court that she physically watched Tyler practice my signature and forge the commercial loan documents. She would hand the prosecution his head on a silver platter, ensuring he took the sole fall for the embezzlement and the fraud. I looked at her, keeping my voice gentle and curious. I asked her what she required in return for this incredible level of cooperation. Monica did not hesitate. The vulnerable, battered wife routine instantly vanished, replaced by the sharp demands of a cornered thief. She demanded $50,000 in untraceable cash. She claimed she needed the money to hire a divorce attorney, pack her bags, and move across the country to start a brand new life, far away from Tyler and the toxic mess he had created. She promised that if I gave her the buyout, she would quietly walk away clean, leaving me with a booming business and zero legal hurdles to clear my property lien. $50,000 for my total freedom, she whispered, treating the betrayal of her husband like a standard corporate discount. I looked at the woman sitting at my kitchen table. She was willing to sell out the man she married for a fraction of the money she had secretly stolen to buy a coastal condo. I slowly reached out and picked up my cell phone, which had been resting face down on the wood right between my coffee cup and her glass of water. I turned the screen over. The bright white light illuminated the dark kitchen. I tapped the large red square in the center of the screen, stopping the voice memo application. The digital timer froze at 24 minutes and 12 seconds. Monica stopped breathing. The confident mercenary glint in her eyes was instantly replaced by genuine suffocating horror. She stared at the glowing screen, realizing with absolute clarity that I had not been captivated by her emotional performance. I had been systematically recording a full, uncoerced confession of her conspiracy and her active attempt to extort a cash buyout. I looked at her, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. In my 35 years of managing supply chains, I have dealt with thousands of failing vendors. Do you want to know the one type of supplier I never ever negotiate with, Monica? I never negotiate with a rat who offers to burn down their own warehouse just to secure a severance package. She tried to lunge across the table to grab the phone, her manicured hands clawing desperately at the air. I calmly pulled the device back easily, avoiding her frantic grasp. I tapped the share icon, attached the audio file, and selected Tyler from my contacts list. I pressed send. A soft, pleasant swoosh sound echoed in the quiet kitchen, confirming the heavy audio file had been delivered directly to her husband at his cheap motel room. I set the phone back down and looked at her pale, trembling face. Tyler just lost his business, his money, and his pride, I said smoothly. Now, thanks to your own mouth, he knows exactly who was holding the knife in the dark. I suggest you leave my house, Monica. You have a very angry husband who is about to ask you a lot of difficult questions about loyalty. Monica stumbled backward, knocking the wooden chair to the floor with a loud clatter. She did not say another word. She turned and sprinted down the hallway, ripping the front door open and running out into the freezing rain. I stood up, picked the fallen chair off the ground, and walked over to the sink to pour her untouched glass of water down the drain. The trap had closed perfectly, crushing the last remaining threat to my complete and total victory. I called the emergency board meeting for 10 in the morning on a Thursday. I chose the main conference room of the brewery, a large glass-enclosed space that overlooked the now completely silent production floor. Tyler had designed this room specifically to intimidate vendors and impress investors. He had purchased a massive slab of polished walnut for the table and installed leather executive chairs that cost more than my first automobile. Today, I was using his expensive stage to permanently end his performance. I arrived 30 minutes early. I took the seat at the absolute head of the table, a position of authority Tyler had always reserved exclusively for himself. Warren Gallagher arrived shortly after, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, carrying his trademark leather briefcase. He did not sit down. He stood near the entrance, flanked by two large, silent men wearing dark uniforms. I had hired private security. I knew exactly how desperate people reacted when cornered, and I was not taking any chances with my physical safety or the security of the building. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Tyler walked in first. He looked entirely hollowed out. He was wearing a rumpled button-down shirt, and his eyes were bloodshot from a lack of sleep and the crushing weight of his impending financial ruin. He avoided looking at me, his gaze fixed firmly on the polished wood of the table. A minute later, Monica arrived. She was wearing dark sunglasses, trying to maintain her aura of high society superiority, but the tight, panicked line of her jaw betrayed her. She did not sit next to Tyler. She walked to the absolute opposite end of the long table, sitting as far away from her husband as physically possible. The air in the room instantly turned toxic, thick with the mutual hatred radiating between them. They were no longer partners in life or in business. They were two enemies forced to share a lifeboat. I did not offer any polite greetings. I did not ask how they were doing. I opened a thick manila folder and placed 3 distinct items on the polished walnut table in front of me. The first was a copy of the official forensic audit report. The second was a high-resolution color copy of the forged commercial equipment loan with my stolen signature clearly visible at the bottom. The third was a small digital voice recorder. The silence in the room was suffocating. I looked at Tyler. I did not see the little boy I had raised. I did not see the son I had sacrificed my retirement for. I saw a stranger, a greedy, entitled man who had casually risked my home to finance his ego. I looked at Monica. I saw a calculating parasite who had tried to extort me to escape the sinking ship she helped destroy. I slid the forensic audit report down the length of the table. I instructed them to turn to page 4. I stated clearly for the official record that the independent audit had uncovered massive systemic embezzlement. I read the numbers aloud, my voice steady and unforgiving. I detailed the $80,000 secretly siphoned from the operating capital. I noted the destination account registered in Monica's maiden name. I confirmed the luxury coastal condo purchase. Tyler stared at Monica, his hands clenching into fists, his breathing becoming ragged and heavy. He was listening to the official, undeniable proof that his wife had robbed him blind while he was risking federal prison to keep her happy. Then I slid the forged loan document forward. I addressed Tyler directly. I told him that I knew exactly how he had obtained my signature. I recounted the Sunday afternoon he asked to borrow my filing cabinet, the hours he spent practicing my handwriting, while I sat in the next room, believing he was a good son. I stated that leveraging my paid-off home without my consent was a severe federal crime. I watched the remaining fight completely drain out of him. He sank lower in his expensive leather chair, utterly defeated, completely destroyed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic mistakes. Finally, I picked up the small digital voice recorder. I looked at Monica, who had suddenly become perfectly still, her eyes wide with terror behind her dark sunglasses. I pressed the play button. The audio was crystal clear. It was the recording from the night she came to my house drenched in rain, begging for a $50,000 buyout. Tyler listened as his wife's voice filled the silent conference room. He heard her offer to testify against him in open court. He heard her promise to hand the prosecution his head on a silver platter to save herself. Tyler let out a sound that was half sob, half furious growl. He lunged across the table toward her, his face twisted in rage. The 2 security guards moved instantly, stepping forward and physically restraining him, forcing him back into his chair. I turned off the recorder. The evidence was presented. The trial was over. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table. As the 80% majority owner of this corporation, I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls, I am officially terminating both of your employment contracts, effective immediately. You are being terminated for gross misconduct, systemic embezzlement, and severe financial fraud. Monica began to stammer, trying to launch into another pathetic excuse, but Warren cut her off sharply. He informed them that their minority shares were currently frozen due to the active embezzlement investigation. They had absolutely zero standing, zero authority, and zero rights within this building. I instructed them to stand up. I demanded they place their corporate keys, their building access cards, and any company credit cards on the table. Tyler reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, his hands shaking violently. He dropped them onto the wood. Monica, realizing her elite facade was completely shattered, threw her access badge onto the table with a furious, defiant scowl. I looked at the 2 security guards standing by the door. Escort them off my property, I ordered. The guards stepped forward, gesturing toward the exit. Tyler and Monica stood up. They did not look at each other. They did not look at me. They walked out of the glass-enclosed conference room and down the stairs to the silent production floor. I watched them walk toward the heavy front doors, the very doors they had locked me out of just a few weeks prior. They were escorted out into the bright morning sun, stripped of their titles, their income, and their stolen empire. They were completely ruined, and I had orchestrated the entire destruction without ever raising my voice. The sudden suspension of their unearned executive salaries acted as a violent and immediate catalyst. Within 72 hours of being escorted off the commercial property, the artificial luxury of their daily lives completely collapsed. They had lived exclusively on the dangerous edge of their credit limits, floating massive monthly balances under the arrogant assumption that my retirement savings would always be there to catch them. Now there was no safety net. The leasing company for the imported sports car was the very first to strike. Tyler had missed 2 consecutive payments, foolishly prioritizing his vanity over his contractual obligations. A heavy tow truck arrived in the middle of the night, its bright amber lights flashing aggressively across the quiet suburban street. It repossessed the luxury vehicle right out of his pristine driveway. Tyler stood on his front porch in his bathrobe, entirely humiliated, as his wealthy neighbors watched the spectacle through their living room blinds. Monica fared no better. Her premium credit cards, the ones she used to exclusively fund her elite wardrobe, and expensive social outings were systematically frozen by the issuing banks. When she attempted to purchase an expensive designer handbag the next morning, to soothe her anxiety, the point-of-sale terminal beeped a loud, embarrassing decline in front of a crowded boutique. The sheer public humiliation of their financial ruin was the final fatal blow to their highly toxic marriage. Without my $4,000 monthly transfer, the mortgage on their heavily financed suburban home went completely unpaid. The bank wasted absolutely no time. By the end of the month, the bright red and white pre-foreclosure notices were prominently taped to their custom mahogany front door for the entire neighborhood to witness. Monica, completely stripped of the wealth and high society status she worshipped, utterly refused to stay in a sinking ship. She packed her expensive designer luggage in the dark, screaming at Tyler that he was a pathetic failure who had ruined her youth. She took a rideshare back to her parents' house, instantly reverting to the role of a victimized daughter. She spun wild, fabricated lies about extreme financial abuse to preserve her own fragile social standing, conveniently omitting the fact that she had attempted to extort me for cash. She left Tyler completely alone in an empty, echoing house with no electricity, as the utility companies had swiftly disconnected the grid due to massive unpaid balances. Forced out by the freezing cold and the suffocating weight of his own monumental failures, Tyler packed a single suitcase and moved into a cheap, dilapidated motel on the far outskirts of the commercial district. The dingy motel room was a stark, brutal contrast to the corner executive office he had occupied just a few weeks prior. The thin walls offered no insulation from the highway noise. The carpet smelled heavily of bleach and stale smoke, and the flickering neon sign outside buzzed relentlessly through the dark night, casting a sickly red glow across his sagging mattress. For the first time in his 34 years, Tyler was entirely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the real world. Desperation is a ruthless teacher. With his professional reputation utterly destroyed in the local business community and facing mounting legal bills from his impending divorce, no reputable company would hire the disgraced former chief executive. He was forced to take a minimum wage job working the grueling graveyard shift at a massive regional shipping warehouse. The relentless physical labor began to systematically strip away his deep layers of arrogance. As he spent 8 hours a night lifting heavy cardboard boxes, sweeping dusty concrete floors, and loading freight trucks in the freezing cold, for pennies his body ached in ways he had never experienced. The loud, chaotic warehouse environment triggered a profound memory. He remembered being a little boy watching me walk through the front door after a 14-hour shift managing supply chains. He remembered the smell of grease and cardboard on my clothes, the way I would sit heavily in the kitchen chair, exhausted, but smiling, because I was providing a secure life for my family. The sheer magnitude of my silent sacrifices finally began to penetrate his thick skull. He realized that the comfortable childhood he had taken for granted, the college tuition I had paid in full, and the financial safety net that had always effortlessly caught him were all built on decades of my own exhausted muscles and sleepless nights. Every time he hoisted a heavy wooden pallet, he calculated how many hours of bone-crushing labor it took to earn a single $100 bill. He finally understood that the $600,000 he had so casually squandered on luxury spa days and tropical vacations was not magic money. It was the physical manifestation of his mother's entire life and my broken back. The crushing reality of his minimum wage existence forced him to look in the smeared bathroom mirror of his motel room and see the devastating truth. He was not a brilliant entrepreneur. He was a spoiled, greedy child who had arrogantly burned down a fortune that took an entire lifetime of grueling labor to build. The safety net was completely gone, leaving him in a terrifying freefall with no bottom in sight. Tyler was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at his bruised and blistered hands when his cell phone rang. It was his newly appointed public defense attorney. The lawyer's voice was tense, completely devoid of any comforting bedside manner. He informed Tyler that the regional bank's fraud department had officially concluded their internal investigation regarding the secondary commercial equipment loan. The bank examiners had successfully cross-referenced the signature on the guarantor agreement with my verified banking records, confirming beyond any shadow of a doubt what we already knew. The lawyer delivered the catastrophic news with blunt, merciless precision. The bank was formally moving forward with severe federal criminal charges for wire fraud and forgery. The attorney explained the strict mandatory sentencing guidelines for commercial fraud of that magnitude, letting the terrifying reality of federal prison wash over the silent phone line. Tyler frantically interrupted the lawyer, his voice trembling with sheer panic. He begged the attorney to reach out to me immediately, assuming that because I was his father, I would inevitably step in to drop the charges and save him at the final hour. He pleaded that it was just a simple family dispute, a minor misunderstanding that could be settled quietly outside of a courtroom. The attorney silenced him with a heavy, exasperated sigh. He explained that I had already visited the bank's corporate office earlier that morning with my own legal counsel. I had successfully cleared the fraudulent lien on my personal home by legally absorbing the entire debt into the brewery's newly stabilized corporate ledger. I had backed the commercial loan with my newly acquired majority equity, completely satisfying the bank's financial concerns and permanently protecting my sanctuary. But the lawyer added, his tone dripping with grim finality. I had explicitly refused to sign a waiver of prosecution. I had looked the bank's fraud investigators directly in the eye and told them to prosecute the forgery to the absolute fullest extent of the law. I had saved the physical business assets from liquidation, but I had deliberately chosen not to protect my son from the criminal fallout of his own actions. Tyler dropped the phone onto the cheap motel carpet, the color completely draining from his face as he realized he was not just facing total bankruptcy. He was facing years in a federal penitentiary, and his father was the one holding the cell door wide open. The rain began to fall shortly after dinner, a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the quiet suburban streets into running rivers. I sat in my comfortable armchair in the living room, listening to the heavy drops drumming rhythmically against the roof tiles. My home was warm and deeply secure. The fraudulent lien had been officially cleared, and the brewery was actively transitioning into stable territory under my absolute control. The chaotic noise of the past few weeks had completely faded, leaving a profound and satisfying silence in my sanctuary. But the fierce storm outside was merely a physical manifestation of the absolute devastation I knew was currently tearing through my son's life. I was quietly reading a thick logistics journal, my reading glasses resting low on the bridge of my nose when the front doorbell suddenly rang. It was well past 10 in the evening. I did not hurry. I marked my page, slowly stood up, and walked down the hallway with measured steps. I did not turn on the bright exterior porch light. I opened the solid oak inner door, but I kept the reinforced metal screen door securely shut and locked between us. Standing on my concrete porch, completely drenched to the very bone, was Tyler. The transformation was absolute and genuinely pathetic. The arrogant young executive who used to wear imported Italian suits and drive a leased European sports car was entirely gone. He was wearing a faded, oversized hooded sweatshirt that clung tightly to his shivering frame. His hair was plastered flat against his pale forehead. His cheap canvas shoes were soaked through, leaving dark, dirty puddles on the welcome mat. The circles under his eyes were deep, bruised hollows of genuine, undeniable terror. He looked like a stray animal, completely broken by the unforgiving elements and the harsh consequences of his own actions. He did not raise his voice. He did not pound his fists aggressively against the mesh screen or demand that I instantly fix his shattered life. He simply stood in the freezing rain, wrapping his arms tightly around his own thin torso, trembling violently. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the loud rushing sound of the overflowing rain gutters. "Please, Dad, just listen to me for one single minute." I did not invite him inside. I did not offer him a warm, dry towel or a hot cup of coffee. I stood in the warm, dry hallway, folding my hands quietly, waiting for him to clearly state his business. Tyler pressed his wet face closer to the screen, the cold rain dripping steadily from his chin. "I am starving, Dad," he sobbed, his shoulders heaving heavily with the agonizing weight of his total ruin. "I have not eaten a real solid meal in 2 days. The warehouse job pays absolutely nothing, and the cheap motel takes every single dollar I earn just so I can sleep on a filthy mattress. My public defender called me this afternoon. He told me the federal prosecutor is not offering any lenient plea deals. He said the regional bank has mountains of irrefutable evidence regarding the forged commercial loan and that I am going to serve real consecutive time in a federal penitentiary." He paused desperately, gasping for air as the freezing rain continued to batter his back. "Please, Dad, I am begging you on my hands and knees. I am not asking you to give me the company back. I know I completely lost that. I am just asking for a small personal loan, just enough cash to buy some basic groceries and hire a decent defense lawyer to fight the bank. Just enough to keep me out of federal prison. I will pay you back every single week from my warehouse checks for the rest of my life. I swear it. I just need a chance to survive." I looked at his bruised, blistered hands gripping the wet metal handle of the screen door. He was finally experiencing the brutal physical toll of the real working world. The endless financial safety net he had taken for granted his entire life was completely gone. But I knew that true redemption required absolute, unvarnished honesty, and Tyler was still holding back the original sin that started this entire cascade of destruction. "Why did you not invite me to the grand opening?" "Tyler," I asked, my voice perfectly level, cutting cleanly and sharply through the chaotic noise of the storm. Tyler flinched, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He squeezed his eyes shut, crying freely and openly into the dark rain. "I am so sorry, Dad," he wept, his voice cracking with the agonizing shame of a coward finally forced to confess his deepest weakness. It was Monica. She was entirely obsessed with curating the perfect visual aesthetic for the wealthy social media influencers. She told me your plain flannel shirts and your worn-out work boots did not fit the elite brand image of the taproom. She said your working-class aesthetic would deeply embarrass her in front of the wealthy local politicians and the high-profile food critics. She demanded we completely exclude you from the guest list. He wiped his wet face with his soaked sleeve, looking at me with pure, desperate regret. And I was so terrified of losing her that I just agreed. I let her ban the man who built my entire world from his own massive investment just to avoid an argument in the office. I was a pathetic, weak coward, Dad. I chose the approval of a superficial woman over the dignity of my own father. I am so incredibly sorry for treating you like an embarrassment. His confession hung heavily in the freezing night air. He had finally admitted the absolute ugly truth. He had willingly sacrificed my dignity on the altar of his wife's vanity. He stood there shivering violently, waiting for the paternal forgiveness that usually follows a tearful, emotional apology. He waited for me to unlock the metal screen door, open my arms, and tell him that a father-deep love conquers all egregious mistakes. He fully expected the old George to miraculously emerge with a warm blanket and a forgiving checkbook. I looked at my son through the rigid metal mesh. I did not feel a single ounce of simmering anger. I did not feel the fiery rage of betrayal or the bitter, sharp sting of resentment. I felt an overwhelming, profound, and entirely cold pity. I looked at the broken, hollow shell of a man who had casually traded his fundamental honor for the fleeting illusion of high society status. He had forged my signature, risked the roof over my head, and allowed his wife to discard me like common trash. I took a slow, deliberate step backward into the warm, inviting light of my hallway. Tyler pressed his wet hands frantically against the screen, his red eyes widening in absolute terror as he realized I was not reaching for the locking mechanism. "I told you, Tyler," I said, my voice quiet and utterly devoid of emotion. "I only help close family. You made your choice 5 days before the opening." "Dad, please, no!" Tyler screamed, his voice tearing through the brutal storm as he rattled the locked metal door with all his remaining strength. "Please do not leave me out here." I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I reached forward and pushed the heavy solid oak door shut, severing his desperate pleading cries completely. I engaged the thick brass deadbolt, hearing the heavy mechanical click echo with absolute finality through the quiet house. I turned off the exterior porch light, plunging him back into the freezing, isolating dark. I walked calmly back to my comfortable living room, sat down in my favorite armchair, picked up my reading glasses, and quietly returned to my logistics journal as the relentless rain washed the final remnants of his betrayal off my front steps. 6 months have passed since that freezing night in the pouring rain. Today, the heavy glass doors of the brewery are propped wide open, welcoming the warm evening breeze. The massive industrial space is completely unrecognizable from the hollow tomb it had been when the vendors revolted. The taproom is absolutely packed with paying customers. There are no exclusive guest lists and no arrogant social media influencers demanding free drinks for exposure. Instead, the room is filled with honest working people. Construction workers in heavy boots sit alongside office managers loosening their ties, and local neighbors gather around sturdy oak tables to share stories and a genuinely good product. The air is rich and heavy with the deep, earthy aroma of roasted malt and fresh hops. The sound of genuine laughter and the steady clinking of thick glass pints echo off the exposed brick walls. I am standing near the back production floor, wiping my hands on a clean cloth, simply watching the beautiful, complex machine operate exactly as it was designed to do. I am not wearing an expensive imported suit. I am wearing my comfortable flannel shirt and my reliable work boots. I am completely in my element. The real heartbeat of this entire operation is standing right next to the massive stainless steel fermentation tanks. His name is Samuel. He is a master brewer with 15 years of practical commercial experience, and he understands the delicate organic chemistry of yeast and temperature control better than anyone in the region. Samuel is exactly the kind of dedicated employee my son Tyler absolutely despised. In the early days of this business, when I was merely a silent investor, Samuel had approached Tyler to respectfully demand fair market wages and proper safety equipment for the production floor. Tyler, blinded by his own toxic arrogance and desperate to save money to fund Monica and her luxury vacations, had immediately fired Samuel for insubordination. Tyler had replaced him with a cheap, inexperienced amateur who barely knew how to operate the expensive imported machinery. The very first administrative action I took after legally assuming 80% majority control was tracking Samuel down. I drove to his house, sat on his front porch, and offered him his job back, along with a comprehensive benefits package and absolute creative control over the brewing process. I brought the supply chain expertise and the financial discipline, while Samuel brought the passion and the product. Together, we stripped away all the pretentious marketing nonsense and focused entirely on creating a reliable, high-quality beverage. We established strict inventory protocols and paid our regional vendors in cash on delivery until we completely rebuilt our commercial credit rating. The vendors who had previously blacklisted the company under Monica and her shadow corporation gladly returned to the loading dock once they saw my name officially registered on the master operating agreement. The financial stabilization of the brewery allowed me to accomplish the most critical objective of this entire ordeal. The heavy, crushing weight of the forged commercial equipment loan is entirely gone. Through aggressive corporate restructuring and the sudden massive influx of actual retail revenue, I generated enough liquid capital to march directly into Mr. Barnes' office at the local bank. I sat in that same leather chair where I had first discovered the horrifying truth about my stolen signature. But this time I was not a victim seeking an explanation. I handed the bank manager a certified cashier check, completely paying off the $150,000 fraudulent debt in a single lump sum. I legally cleared the massive lien against my personal residential property. My house, the sanctuary I had built with my late wife, is completely safe. The walls that hold my most precious memories are secure and unburdened by the selfish greed of an ungrateful child. I protected the equity my wife had literally worked her entire life to build. I ensured her legacy was not squandered on leased sports cars and coastal vacation condos. I kept my promise to her, even if it meant destroying the very son we had raised together. I do not speak to Tyler anymore. I do not receive tearful phone calls in the middle of the night, and I do not bail him out of his self-inflicted miseries. I know exactly where he is, and I know exactly what he is doing, because the legal system ensures his actions are a matter of public record. Tyler narrowly avoided serving time in a federal penitentiary. The prosecutor offered him a strict plea deal primarily because I had completely satisfied the financial damages, with the bank preventing any actual institutional loss. Tyler pleaded guilty to a lesser felony charge of commercial fraud. He is currently serving 5 years of heavily monitored probation. He is mandated by the court to complete 2,000 hours of grueling community service picking up trash along the county highways in a bright orange vest. Furthermore, he is working a brutal minimum wage job at a massive regional logistics warehouse loading heavy freight trucks in the freezing cold. He spends his nights in a cheap, run-down motel, completely stripped of his arrogant executive titles and his high society illusions. He is finally experiencing the agonizing, bone-crushing reality of the blue-collar labor he used to mock. He is learning exactly how much sweat it takes to survive in a world without an invisible safety net. Monica finalized the divorce months ago, completely abandoning him the exact moment his bank accounts hit zero. He is utterly alone, serving his sentence in quiet desperation. I feel absolutely no remorse for his current situation. I gave him every opportunity to be a good man, and he actively chose to be a thief. I walk away from the noisy production floor and take a seat at the far end of the long, polished mahogany bar. I signal the bartender, who immediately slides a glass of our signature dark roasted stout across the smooth wood. I wrap my hand around the cold glass, feeling a deep, profound sense of accomplishment. A few minutes later, the heavy front doors swing open, and Warren Gallagher walks into the tap room. The ruthless commercial attorney is dressed in his usual sharp charcoal suit, holding his trademark leather briefcase. He spots me at the end of the bar and walks over, taking the empty stool right next to mine. He does not say a single word. He simply signals the bartender and orders a glass of his own. We sit together in the comfortable, bustling atmosphere of the thriving business we legally conquered. Warren raises his glass, looking at me with a profound expression of professional respect. I raise my glass and clink it gently against his. We share a completely silent toast to the ruthless beauty of perfectly executed contracts and the unyielding power of absolute leverage. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, bitter stout. I look around the crowded room, watching the happy customers and the diligent staff working in perfect harmony. I lost my only son to his own insatiable greed and toxic vanity. I lost the illusion of a perfect family. But as I sit here in the very building he tried to lock me out of, I realize exactly what I have gained. I reclaimed my personal dignity. I fiercely protected the financial legacy of the woman I loved, and I secured the remainder of my life from those who sought to exploit my paternal kindness. I learned that true power does not require loud shouting or empty emotional threats. True power is understanding the complex machinery of consequence and possessing the quiet, calculated patience to pull the correct lever at the exact right moment. Tyler and Monica believed that my quiet suburban life made me weak. They believed my comfortable flannel shirts and my outdated kitchen table made me an easy target. They completely forgot that a man who spends his entire life building supply chains knows exactly how to dismantle them. They learned the hardest lesson a thief can ever learn. A silent man who knows the value of his own labor is always the most dangerous opponent in the room. The ultimate lesson of the brewer's bitter draft is that true power never resides in loud arrogance or flashy displays of unearned wealth. It lives in silent, calculated competence. Greed fundamentally blinds people to the structural pillars supporting their very existence. Tyler and Monica fatally mistook a father's unconditional generosity for weakness and his blue-collar humility for financial ignorance. They failed to realize that a man who spends his entire life meticulously building and securing legacies possesses the exact skills required to ruthlessly dismantle them. Respect the quiet ones, because when you bite the hand that feeds you, you should never be surprised when it drops a legal guillotine. If you have ever had to set a ruthless boundary to protect your own peace and dignity from entitled family members, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your survival story in the comments below.